how do you think schools can be transformed to reflect the importance of play for development? Anyone?
When we say schools, do you think they mean elementary or young children?
I think they mean young children, but they might mean elementary, so
Right.
don't hold back.
Okay. Well, I was with a group of early childhood educators in Minnesota in the spring, and one of the women in my workshop was really more or less in tears because there simply was no time when she was allowed to have play in her classroom. And so we talked about the subversive approach to play and how to, sneak it in whatever little cracks and crevices one can find. And sometimes that's what you have to do to get it started. And, and sometimes you'll have a supervisor who just doesn't get it and really makes your life miserable. And I'm not quite sure what to do with that. But I would go on being subversive anyway because it's so good for the children. And even if it's just to do a nursery rhyme now and again, or a little song, or, give them a bit of Play-Doh and, have them hide it when the supervisor comes. I don't know. I was thinking as I was preparing for this of a conversation I had with a teacher some years ago. It was in southern Pennsylvania. I had given a talk about play. She came up afterwards and said, I really believe in play. But the legislature in our area has legislated every minute of the preschool program, and they left no time for play. And then she looked over her shoulder. She said, I break the law every day. And I let the children play for 15 minutes. And that was 20 years ago. This is not a new problem. This is not new. But so I think we need to speak up. We need to write letters to the editors. We need to talk with principals. We need to be a voice. Look at you all. And you're probably mostly from this area. Early childhood educators need to speak up. We just need to speak up. We can't be quiet any longer. And parents, you have the power of a voice. Believe me, every policymaker listens to the parents. You have the vote, right? And they care about that. We just have to speak up. And I don't ever want to hear from an early childhood educator again, I can't speak up, I might lose my job. I don't want anyone to lose their job, but for heaven's sakes, if we don't speak up, you're going to quit because you can't stand your job. Because we hear from a lot of teachers now who are quitting. We just need to do it. That's what I would say.
Thank you. So let's delve a little bit deeper into that. And how can we respond to those who view direct instruction as necessary to prepare children for kindergarten, and particularly low SES children?
Show them the evidence that doesn't work. The evidence that John talked about, and the evidence for recess and what's going on in Finland that we know about, all are evidence-based. I guess it's faith-based systems that say no child left behind and teach to the test, and Mandarin by the time you're 3 is better, and you have to have faith to believe that. It's not, and the evidence is to the contrary.
We have a paper on our website that's called Crisis in Early Education, an Evidence-Based Case for Play-Based Learning. And it summarizes a lot of research that's helpful. And we especially are always looking for long-term research, because short-term, almost any intervention that you do with young children you see gains for a couple of years. But the problem is that if it's from an instructional program, the gains fade away. But I will tell you that it's, the mindset in this country is so strong. So you just have to keep speaking it, and speaking the truth, because I did a presentation this year where I got really slammed about one of the pieces of research that we often cite, which is a high scope study comparing 3 curriculum approaches, one of which was very instructional, and those children did so much worse in life. They were followed to age 23 than the children from the play-based programs. And nobody ever talks about that study. They all talk about, what's the other one, Perry Preschool. And no one says that Perry Preschool was a play-based program, which it was, that it matters what kind of preschool it is. Not all preschools are the same. But in this comparative curriculum one, I went back to the researchers and said, look, they're complaining that the research is not valid because it was self-reporting. And then I learned not all of it was self-reporting, that they looked at the school records and the children in the instructional preschool, 46% of them needed special ed for behavioral difficulties as they went through elementary, compared to something like 7% of the children from the play-based programs. And when it came to arrests for felonies and they looked at police records, I think it was 36% of the children from the instructional program were later arrested for felonies, compared to a very small number from the play-based programs. So there is some good long-term research out there, and people don't want to hear it, but we just have to keep talking about it anyway.
So I'm not a teacher or in the play arena, but I hear the same themes about changing human behavior, which is, so I'm in the medical world, and trying to get doctors to change practice takes 20 years. So even when you have, and we did it with evidence. We had best evidence for brain trauma patients, and it took 20 years to convince smart neurosurgeons. But you find out that it's not the evidence, it's something else. Usually when you're having an argument with somebody and you're trying to resolve it and it doesn't get resolved, there's a third person involved. So usually when you're trying to resolve an issue, there's a third thing that you're not addressing. And for the neurosurgeons, it was the guys that were in private practice coming at 3 o'clock in the morning to putting a brain pressure monitor in a 20-year-old where they don't get reimbursed, and then they get to spend the whole week taking care of that kid. Interferes with their operations, which is but nobody addresses it. See, and the problem doesn't get solved because that's not solved. Then you go international and you look at India, for instance, developing with all the car accidents and all that. You talk to the officials about putting a trauma system in, take care of people properly, save their lives. They just go blank. You don't get anywhere. Then you realize they're spending 2% of GDP. It's money. They take your system. They think they're going to go to 10 or 12%. And where's that money going to come from? So you have to solve the problem. So I wonder, just asking the people here, if you've really sought out the third person, the what's going on, that this is, I mean, I don't know, did you do a poll of, I'm just sitting from the outside, but we did a poll of all the trauma centers in the United States and found out what's going on. And then we really tried to solve the problem. Still took 20 years, but I think that it seems like all the parents would, I don't know, maybe they don't, agree that play is a good thing. Maybe not. Maybe they think that if you go to Singapore or something, you see in the shopping centers, they have these training classrooms for kids after school. They go there and they're spending 12, 14 hours a day taking tests and so on. So, but I sense there's a problem that's not being addressed. I don't know, just from an outside perspective.
Well, I can speculate psychiatrically that you can have a cognitive assurance that the evidence is right and that, yes, play is really significant, and yet if you didn't play yourself, and if you were raised to think it was trivial and only for kids, and you have a feeling state about that, there's a disconnect between cognition and the feeling state, and the feeling state wins. So look what happened with smoking. More doctors smoke Camel than any other cigarette. I mean, how long did it take for that to go away? Well, it took years with all the evidence. And yet, when I was in medical school, half my class were smokers until we had our sophomore year at the VA doing autopsies, where most of the veterans who were dead had black, smelly, tarry lungs from a lifetime of smoking. Those guys quit because their viscera changed from that experience. So I don't know exactly how you do that, how you change the visceral feeling. I've had a number of individuals who cognitively agree that yes, play is really significant, and they'll go right along with the evidence, but they were raised by parents who only honored their performance. They're high performance people who sort of live through competitive performance, so the play never makes it with them. So I don't have any easy answers, but this is part of my shrink experience.
Has anyone done like a poll of all teachers who teach kindergarten and preschool and see what their attitudes are towards it?
What we've done some polls in LA and New York, and the results were almost identical, that the vast majority of the kindergarten teachers really favored play. What they were saying was their administrators did not. So they had a whole battle with their school principal or whoever that was. That was part of the problem. The other thing is, starting back in the 70s, when academics began to come into kindergartens, and I would say to people, well, where's the studies on this? And no one had studies. Well, why are you making these changes? The answer then was that it was what the parents wanted, right? They wanted to see their children get ahead in life. Yeah. And so that still continues today, that most parents feel they're being good parents if they are, if their child is accelerated. They all like to live in Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average, and heavens forbid if your child isn't. So, so reaching the parents is a really important thing. But there's a few things happening. There was a while when they were also opposed to play outside of school. They just were opposed to play. But recent surveys of parents show that actually they do value play now, not necessarily in early childhood, but in general, though they don't know how to bring it back. But they would like their children to have more playtime. So that's a significant step, that their attitude about play itself is changing. And then I think if we can show them, for example, there was an IBM Institute study of 1,500 CEOs that found that the number one thing the CEOs wanted in their employees was creativity. And, and yet we're taking it away in preschool and kindergarten. And also there's a study by a researcher at William & Mary College that showed that creativity scores in this country were going down. And I called her last year and I said, what's been the result of your research? Because it was written up in Newsweek, it got a lot of publicity. And she said, I never heard from any educators. The people that were really concerned were the business schools. And they wanted her to help them bring creative thinking into their business courses. And at first she said she didn't want to do that. She was an educator. And she just thought, this is ridiculous to bring it in at college when we've taken it out of preschool and kindergarten. But she finally gave in because they were the only ones interested. So I have this feeling that if we could get the business community on board about the importance of creativity and seeing how it starts early, that maybe they would have a lever that might change things. And just one other comment is, we're always very concerned about the global economy and a lot of concern about China and its rise in the global economy. China is desperately looking for ways to bring creativity into education. They realize that they've had a solid education in one way, but it's not at all creative. And just, from the vantage point of Waldorf education, which is known as a creative education, 10 years ago there were no Waldorf schools in China, and now there's 300 kindergartens, 30 schools, and about 6 kindergarten training programs. The Chinese are desperate, and it's not just Waldorf, for anything that brings creativity into their education. So, I feel like the more we can talk about that, there was a big New Yorker article on that, the more we make visible to parents that a shift in the paradigm is needed, a shift in the thinking. And when you talked about tobacco, people worked at tobacco from every angle, right? There was the Surgeon General, there were the lawsuits, there were the stockholder meetings, and it still took 20 years or so. It just takes time, but you've got to work at these things from every angle. And I am convinced we'll get play back in early childhood education. But we just have to really work it from many points of view, many ways. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for being very frank. This is so huge that I hardly know what to say to it, but I'm extremely grateful that you bring it up and you name it, because it's partly in this country, we see it as the economic divide, it's partly the racial divide. It's not just that, though. We have a summer place in the Appalachian area of Tennessee, where there's a lot of poverty, but it's all white, but it's the same issues there. Probably no one has bought into early academics as much as lower income parents and the policymakers who claim to be, concerned and responsible. But I know one leading educator in this country, I'm not going to name her at the moment, although she's been very public about her views, is brilliant on the subject of play, but says, when it comes to low-income children, they have 2.5 hours a day in preschool to catch up with others. There's no time for play. They can play at home. They just need to do their academics. And the rest of us just look at her and think, and you think they're going to absorb those academics for 2.5 hours a day and then homework besides? And yet she's convinced that they will. I'm not convinced. I see no evidence of it. I see a lot of evidence of children being turned off. The study that Walter Gilliam from Yale did of preschools found that expulsion from preschools was 3 times higher than the rate for K to 12, and that 4.5 times more boys were expelled than girls, and a lot of it are minority children. And when we asked him about play, and he did a statistical run on that, he found that the preschools with the most play had the lowest expulsion rates. So I think especially for low-income children, we're going in the wrong direction. But it is a tough one to argue, and I have to say that, as a white person, middle-class white person arguing it, it's even tougher, because it's so easy for people to kind of say, yeah, but you don't really care about our children. It's a tough one. Anything to do with poverty and race in this country is tough. But this is a tough one, and I'm grateful to you for bringing it up.
So along those lines, one of the things that has come up in some of the questions is, have you seen schools that have been particularly successful at embracing the value of play? And what factors do you think contribute to that success? Because maybe that's a part of starting to make that shift.
No, you go ahead.
There's a pioneer in play by the name of Joe Frost. Some of you may know about him, who's written a book called The History of Childhood Play. And for 38 years, Joe and his wife, Betty, have been involved in the Redeemer School, which is a Lutheran school in the inner city of Austin, which is multi-ethnic with a lot of scholarship students, and initially had a very high index, for example, of kids who were obese and having problems. Well, Joe has pioneered both in playground design and has a weekly meeting with the teachers and staff there, and his wife taught there, has also established an adventure playground that is adjacent right to the school in a drainage area that they were able to put some plants and shrubs and trees into. And the long-term follow-up over these 38 years of these kids has been remarkable. So that's a success story, but it took leadership, involvement with the staff, a dedicated, wonderful human being who's a warm-hearted, common sense guy who grew up on 40 acres with a deeply impoverished background in Arkansas when he was a young man, and became an endowed professor at the University of Texas. So I've seen it through his eyes happen, and I've visited there a few times. It's extremely inspiring, and the kids take care of each other on the playground. If there is a kind of a fat kid who's klutzy, there was some compassion and help for that kid, which you almost never see in a traditional playground. And this was done by the kids, so that's a success story in my limited experience. I'm not an educator, I'm a doc, so,
Can I want to ask a question, Joan, because, so I noticed you had because everyone's talking about play-based, and then you ask people what is play, and they go, well, I can't really define it, but I want everyone to use it. That's kind of a difficult argument. So, but you define play by 3 things, and what all 3 of them had, the child initiates the action. There were different categories, but they all were child initiated. And that seemed, and I put that up too, you put that up, that seems to be a really strong theme, that child initiates the action, as opposed to teacher initiates the action. Now, a teacher can initiate the action, and the kid can be interested, maybe get play. I mean, but it all is, so the rote-based instruction where you don't care what the kid is interested or not, they've got to learn, okay? Which if they're not paying attention, they're not going to learn. It becomes torture for the kid and torture for the parent. So I'm just wondering if you define play more precisely, maybe then then you could have people understand it. Because I think that play is like attention. It's got so many different meanings to it, and play and work are sort of like meant to be opposite each other, and maybe need another term. I don't know, but I think that I think that's part of the problem. But I think, it seems to me, but it's sort of an underlying assumption that play is child initiated, and that's where the benefits come. And I would agree with you. We all seem to agree with you, on that point. To what extent can you have other forms that are child initiated? Like suppose they want to read, child initiated reading. That's fine, and it fits into other people's schema. But it's a child initiated part. So how would you take that and allow that?
Well, for one thing, I like saying play-based experiential learning. Because the experience, children do a whole lot of discovery, which you could call play, and it is that, but also that the teacher can bring experiences to the child. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's good education, but they don't need to bring it in a didactic way, but in an engaging way.
Engaging.
Yeah, engaging.
Right, that's the word.
And I prefer that over teachers trying to tell the children what to play. Which I was telling you my little thing last night that I sometimes feel, because there's so much teacher-led play now, that it's as if the teachers have said, okay, we get it, play is really important. It's too important to leave it to the children. It only counts if we're in there with them.
Part of the reason I put intrinsic motivation into my title was that play can have exactly what you said, which is two broad meanings, not well defined. But intrinsic motivation is something that is self-organizing, comes from deeply within the temperament and the timing and the gender and the culture of the child. And if the teacher and the child resonate, if the parent and the child resonate on that intrinsic motivation, both will value the play. So that's kind of why I've used that term.
So I don't mean to be contrarian, but suppose some kid is really interested in reading at 3 years old. You're not going to stop them. They want to do math at 3 years old. They
That
want to
can
do
be
something.
Intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
So there's commonality there with the people that want them to do these kinds of. But you're saying you have to have proof that intrinsic motivation is a better driver and makes them learn rather than external, which is probably easy evidence to come by, right? Forcing some kid doesn't want to do something, as opposed to some kid that does want to do something, how well do they learn? There's plenty of experiments in neuroscience where they can show that if you're paying attention, you'll learn. If you don't pay attention, you don't learn. So I'm wondering if there's a way of rather than beating them over the head with play, beating them over the head with a more precise definition that incorporates some of the things that they would like based upon the child's interest. And maybe there's a common.
Sometimes the language that's used is child-initiated learning versus teacher-directed learning, which also can work. All of these things can work up to a point and they start to fall apart. But I think I see what you're saying, and I think that I know that when we used to just say, children need play, there were certain things that immediately happened in adult brains. One was they thought we were saying that 3 hours a day the children should just play, and there was no real role for the adult in the teacher in the setup, which is, for me, not at all the case. And the other is that people pictured chaos, because play can be, even good play can be chaotic, and when teachers aren't there to kind of give support and presence, early childhood play can be unbelievably chaotic, which is, in my view, not good for anyone. Moments of chaos is one thing, but hours of chaos, days of chaos, I mean, I was a young teacher once, and I know all about chaos in the classroom, and I didn't like it, and I don't think it was good for the children. But it took me a while to really learn how to do it without the chaos, and without, on the other hand, sitting on the children. There's a delicate thing in there about how to do this well, to be present and yet not hovering and not directing, and there's a kind of invisible quality to it, but a very present quality. You don't check out on the children. I just keep coming back to the thought that people need to see it. And when people see it, a lot of them get it. And when we talk about it, they don't get it. All these other things pop up, right? But then they walk into a classroom where it's being well done, and it's like, oh, even if they didn't have it as children, something resonates. And I think it's partly because play lives so deeply in us that when we actually see it being well done, something resonates. So I just kind of feel we need the courage to do it. Just do it, and hope for the best. I don't think it can get a whole lot worse than it is at the moment. It probably can. But I mean, one teacher told us that her principal said, if I see any teacher with their class out at recess, I am fining the teacher $5. So this kindergarten teacher said, okay. Every morning she'd go in and lay a $5 bill on the principal's desk and then take her children out to play. I mean, really, we hear the worst tales imaginable, but somehow the teachers also find their ways through it, and then people begin to recognize it. Because we also hear fabulous tales out of these slightly subversive actions that parents and teachers take in order to bring play back.
Just to continue the contrarian approach. So
You were educated on the East Coast, weren't you?
He's an academic,
Wait,
come on.
no, England. I went to school in England, so
Oh, okay.
Okay.
They're really good at being contrarians.
there are a lot of
Okay.
rules.
Yeah.
So these other people who've got all this, test-taking teaching, right? Very rigorous, well-defined, all that. Then you have chaos, which is play.
Right.
But if you say play is not chaos, and play you have to do this, and you have to do this, and you have to do this, and of course, you lay it out in a very organized way that looks very comparable to what you do for kids that have to take tests and all that. But it actually, in there, you have all the things that you want. Because even when you're describing these kids, there's a lot of, you're saying you're not letting the kids just do whatever they want. There's something involved. It has to engage them, be involved in certain qualities of play, and so on. So if you define it in that way and say this is what we're talking about is play, and it's cognitively enhancing, it causes creativity, rest of life. So it's a lot easier for people to understand than just say you just let them loose and they become creative 20 years later. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, no, I do see what you mean. I think one always has to be careful not to so define it that it.
There's ways of defining things.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. That it has a playful
Yeah.
quality to the.
Yeah, you can define
there's a
it so it looks
process
like it's
involved.
really rigid, but it's really
Yeah.
not. Yeah.
Well.
It's people they can do things within that structure.
Yeah, I mean, you want it open-ended enough that the thing breathes. That's the thing. And our usual way of thinking and testing doesn't allow for much breath, right? It's pretty rigid. And I think if we carry that thinking over to play, then we probably are in more trouble than we are at the moment, frankly. But that doesn't mean that we can't say, look, here's the things I look for when the children are playing. I look for how are they handling themselves socially? Can they self-regulate? Are they getting into fights all the time, or are they finding their way through and playing amicably,
Right.
with each other? I mean, you can give quite a list of the things to a parent. This is what I'm looking for, in a child, and this is what I'm sorry, but I'm not seeing this in your child. I'm seeing. Of course, one finds a tactful way to say it. I had good relations with parents. I like working with parents, but sometimes you have to be frank and describe what you're seeing or invite them in so they can see it for themselves. But mostly what you want to do is to be able to say to parents, this is what I'm looking for in children who are good, strong players. Because the children who are good, strong players tend to be, cognitively very alert and bright and socially very competent and gifted and physically quite healthy. You know, so we want all of those things for children, and I've never met a parent who didn't, even though they might put more emphasis on the cognitive over the other, but when really challenged, I mean, I don't know any parent that would say, oh, I don't care about the social part. I mean, you know, or I don't care if my child's physically, you know, competent. I just want them to be, you know, smart. You know, I guess there's some parents somewhere, but that's pretty extreme. That's not what parents want. And there's surveys of parents that say they want their children to be well balanced and well rounded and you know, successful, not just in terms of making money, but in their values in life. And all of these things we're talking about today, they all contribute to that. But we have to kind of build some bridges so parents can see how these things contribute. And that this is not, you know, there's not an abyss here, but that play actually helps children bridge from the physical to the emotional to the cognitive and integrates. And frankly, I think that's where the brain research could be extremely helpful in showing whether or not play is a really integrative activity, which a lot of us sense that it is. Right. And it brings those realms together probably more than most activities do. I mean, I'm excited about the possibilities of how we as educators could work with medical researchers. I've worked with a lot of doctors, but not with a medical researcher.
You know, I think like a doc, so I quack like a doc. But one of the things that got me into play was the spectrum of play deprivation. And I began to think of it as I took all these histories and would see serious deprivation, whether it's in childhood or adulthood, and markers, almost like anemia would be seen by a low hemoglobin. And when you see rigidity in thinking, smoldering depression, lack of optimism, difficulty in engagement, at any age, you begin to get some sense that there's play deprivation. And I think no parent, I mean, you need to be tactful, but I think no parent wants their child to suffer. And yet play deprivation is a suffering component and is a health component as far as I'm concerned, and has profiles. And those profiles aren't objectively clearly defined as yet through research, but they're clear enough that a narrative can be provided for your child is having some play deprivation, or you yourself, or me, or any of us. If we get into an overwork situation, you lose the byproducts of play. So to me, that's a marker, just like poor nutrition or low hemoglobin or other health indices. At least that makes sense to me. Quack, quack.
One of the questions that came up was, is play deprivation reversible?
Well, I think he answered some of that in the feral children and the severe. In my clinical experience, the holes in a play lifetime can be filled rather well if the early deprivation isn't just devastating. There really is. If I had my therapeutic life to live over as a psychotherapist, I would certainly use more play and less discussion of what mommy and daddy did wrong.
So perhaps that gives us all a little bit of permission to play for ourselves, just in case. Before we finish this panel, are there any public policy makers advocating for play that early childhood professionals could or should support? Any advice to us in your closing comments?
Patty Murray, who's a senator from Washington State, was an early childhood educator herself. And I haven't met with her, but I've met with her aide a couple of times, and he's very good and in great agreement with whatever we bring to him. And otherwise, it's a little bit more challenging. Not that she's alone. I'm sure there's some others on Capitol Hill. But it is challenging. We spend, from time to time, we spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill. I think, at the state level, one often has easier access to the legislators, and I just always feel these decisions about children are actually better made locally rather than nationally, although I'm far from being a conservative politically, but I happen to agree with the conservative approach that the further up the ladder you make educational decisions, for one thing, the harder it is to change them. And we get it wrong so often that you want a system that you can change when you've got it wrong. And the closer it is to the classroom, the easier it is to make the changes. And the higher up the decision making is, the harder. We've argued for all kinds of things nationally that we've lost on. And yet, we lost on high stakes testing. We argued so strongly that children should be protected from high stakes testing when No Child Left Behind was being passed. And we lost. But now there's a coalition of over 800 organizations that are opposed to high stakes testing of children. So sometimes you can lose in the short run, and yet the ideas percolate along and really come back later. I traveled a lot in Eastern Europe in 1979. If anyone had told me that communism was going to end in 10 years, I would have thought they were nuts. And I think about that often because we want changes almost as big as that change. And if that change could happen, these changes can happen. But exactly who to go to get them is not always so clear. So your representative in Sacramento will listen to you because you have a vote. And they care about that vote. You know, however much money contributors give them doesn't matter on election day. Your vote matters. And I've been astonished when we've been on Capitol Hill how much attention they pay if you can vote for that candidate. They listen with different ears. So take advantage of that. I mean, democracy is stronger than we think. You know, the individual voice and vote is really actually still quite powerful and worth working with.
Well, please join me in thanking this panel. They did a great discussion.